Hey now, Brawlers, it's time for another Board Game Brawl review with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com.
Hey now, today we're going to take a look at Barbarossa from ArcLight Games and now Kamikaze Games. This is a deck building game that actually was originally released in 2010 in Japan, which means what? Dominion was 2008? Maybe it was 2009? This was one of the first games to hitch its wagon to the star that was Dominion in the deck building genre. But of course, there's quite a few differences between Barbarossa and Dominion. First off, while this has these static card piles that Dominion is known for that you're going to be purchasing cards from, this one actually has combat, sort of, in the form of a different type of currency that you're going to be using to conquer cities. Conquer cities? Well, what cities, might you ask? Well, Russian cities. Russian cities, that's kind of interesting. What exactly is the setting of this game? This setting is alternate wartime. Maybe World War II? Probably World War II, but an alternate history one. What's in this alternate history? Scantily clad anime girls who are in the German army. And when I say the German army in World War II, you probably have a certain connotation in your mind. And what I'll say is that there's no swastikas in this game, but there certainly are a lot of iron crosses. So you can already tell where this is going. This is going to be a very interesting review and final thoughts. And you're probably already confused, but let me go ahead and show you what the game is all about. Then we're going to come back. I'll let you know what I think.
Alright, I'm going to give you a very brief rundown of Barbarossa. This is a competitive deck building game for 2 to 4 players. The goal is to have the most victory points by the end of the game, and the end of the game is going to be triggered when you finally invade Moscow at the bottom of the city deck, and someone invades it successfully. The game automatically ends, and you add up your points. Usually the person who invaded Moscow is going to be the winner, but not necessarily. So I'll talk more about this in my final thoughts, but the general theme is that all the players represent Army Corps regiments in the German army. And given the fact that there's an iron cross depicting the back of all of the cards, and given the sort of alternate time history period it's supposed to be in, your German soldiers in sort of a faux World War II, where you're only fighting Russia, it's a little bit confusing, probably on purpose. There's no swastikas in the game, but definitely, it's kind of skeevy. We'll talk about that in my final thoughts. But on top of that, not only are you weird pseudo-German soldiers, you are also scantily clad anime girls. Very scantily clad in some instances. That's just kind of the thing with this game. So just to give you a general and quick indication, yes, there are cards like the Führer's Suggestion. This is why the game is more than a little bit controversial. But let me go ahead. We'll talk more about that in my final thoughts. Let's talk about the gameplay itself. This is a Dominion-style deck builder, meaning that you have static piles of cards that you'll be purchasing during the course of the game. It doesn't have a rotating lineup like Ascension. And I'll mention this in my final thoughts. This game came out in 2010, so it's actually a very, very, very close to when Dominion originally came out. Now, at the beginning of the game, you're actually going to randomly remove one pile, or deterministically do it. So let's just say randomly, this pile is, boom, gone. But other than that, everything else is still going to be in play. You're also every player is going to start off with the same deck of 6 horse-drawn transport cards and 2 Grenadier Regiment cards. And these are a good place to start as far as explaining the basic concepts of the game. Most of the deck building things in the game are pretty self-explanatory if you've played deck builders before. And again, I'll warn you now, these are very scantily clad anime chicks. Anyways, you have horse-drawn transport, Grenadier Regiment. These are your starting cards. Up in the top corner, this is where tactic points are. If the card requires you to spend tactic points, that's where they are. All the supply cards require you to spend 0, but some of the cards, like Grenadier Regiment, are going to require you to spend tactic points. You can think of these as actions from Dominion. The more actions you have, the more you can do things. You have 1 automatic action per turn, but other than that, you're going to have to find a way to accrue more tactic points in a single turn. And the opposite corner is the cost of the card if you buy it from the supply. The horse-drawn transport and other types of supply cards are actually going to give you more supply points in order to buy cards, and also a very few special card effects are kicked off by using supply points instead of tactics points. But the main thrust of the game, so to speak, is actually in deploying cards as army, battalions. In this case, army infantry. The grenadier is the type of card that the Grenadier Regiment is. You're trying to deploy these cards, and that's in trying to accrue combat points in order to take the different city cards. It's kind of hard to see some of the symbology here, but you see that these cards actually give you the red, which are combat points, which you're going to need in order to fight through the cities. So if I were to deploy this card, or actually play this card, for a tactic point, I would get the top part of the card in the white box. The play bonus here, the green, is that I get an extra recruitment for the turn. But then I may deploy this card. When I deploy a card, it's going to go into a separate area. So I have my play area as I'm playing cards from my deck in typical deck building fashion. But then I have my deployment area where cards will actually stay in play. They usually will come into play exhausted, which is tapped, not to get sued or anything. But then on later rounds, I can actually exhaust them again. They'll unexhaust at the start of my turn in order to get combat points that are going to be used to take any of these site cards. And a lot of times it'll say, exhaust a card, exhaust it to get 1 combat point, but then return it to the stack of the supply, really exhaust it in order to get an additional combat point. In other words, sacrifice it, which sometimes you might want to do. Now, if we take a look at these site cards over here, a couple of them are just sort of weaker cards that you get if you have nothing else to do with your combat points. This is the cost of combat points that you need. For instance, the Fortified Hill here, as soon as you conquer it, you're going to deploy it to your deployment area. And then on a future turn, when you can only do combat once per round, by the way. On a future turn, you can sacrifice it and put it back onto the top of the stack in order to subtract 1 from the cost of a city that you're trying to conquer. On the other hand, the more advanced version of that would be the strategic position, which costs you 7 combat points, and if you take it, you deploy it automatically, just like the Fortified Hill, and you're going to get a victory point if you hold on to it until the end of the game. But if you choose to sacrifice it early, you actually get -2 towards the cost of whatever city you're trying to conquer. And let's go ahead and take a look at those city cards. So the city costs a lot of combat points. You see much more than those other cards. There's Russian soldiers depicted on them. You're actually going to have the Moscow card on the bottom of the deck, which is the costliest card to take by far. But there's also some really other powerful cities that you might have to take shuffled into the rest of them that are much more powerful than the rest of them, of the other cards, if I'm being redundant. So if you think that you have enough combat power accrued to take out one of the city cards that's on top, you can go ahead and do that, and if you're successful, you get a lot of points. But there's a couple of things. First off, just fighting the card, all of these cards say that you have to exhaust a bunch of tanks and potentially soldiers if you can't exhaust tanks, and discard them from play, actually, which is called forfeiting in this game. But in addition, as soon as you decide to, you lock in and decide to combat the city, you have to draw one of these event cards. And these event cards are going to add more combat strength to the city in question that you're facing. But if you're able to successfully conquer the city, you'll usually take that event card as something into your deck. Like in this case, the Russian Guards tank will become a card that you can use later for a tactic point. If you hold on to it, it gives you 3 victory points, and if you scrap it, you can actually take a Panzer tank from the supply. So that's something to keep in mind. Whereas other cards like the Führer's Fury costs you 1 tactic point to play on a future turn, and you're actually able to scrap a card from someone else's deployment area, and so on and so forth. Some of them are good, and some of them are really, really bad for you. Actually, a couple of more notable ones, like Rasputina there, you can actually stick her in front of another player if you successfully take the city, and that will keep them from, kind of forget what it does. You can't use any of your tanks or assault guns unless you pay, or unless you just can't do that unless you actually pay some tactic points to get rid of her. Or General Winter, that's the one I was originally thinking of, where you have to pay supply points just to unexhaust your troops at the start of every turn. So there can be some nasty things in that deck. But you're going to take that event card if you successfully take the city. You'll take the city card, put it in front of you. No one can take it away from you at that point. You're going to get those victory points at the end of the game. If you go through the entire stack, go through Moscow, then the game is actually going to end. Let's take a look at a few of the other cards just to give you a general taste of what's going on. Some of the cards, even the ones that aren't troops that you can deploy, just give you special effects, like the artillery battalion here gives you a tactic point, which means you can play it for a tactic point, get another one back in return, and it's going to give you 4 combat. Whereas here's one I'm thinking of. Yeah, the armored Scout Battalion gets you 2 tactic points and gets you a couple of combat as well. So you kind of have to decide what you want to focus on. Do you want to focus on trying to get as many troops out or get tactic points and so on? Here's an example of sort of a low-level combat troop, but better than your Grenadier Regiment. Whereas all the way up at the... Oh, that's a cool card, too. That one actually lets you draw cards and potentially forfeit it to draw even more cards, so it can be powerful. These are tactics cards, or strategy cards, I'm sorry. These cards all give you some sort of different special ability, like a lot of money all at once you buy them and put them in your deck and use them later. However, they always go back to the stack after you use them, so they're very, very temporary. Up here at the top are the most powerful of the cards, the tanks. You have the Panzer Regiment, the SS Panzer Regiment. They cost a lot, but they're going to give you a lot of combat power towards taking the city. And over here is actually the support deck. The support deck is going to be a randomized stack of cards, which you can only purchase the top of, and they're going to give you some powerful effect that the other cards don't. But again, it's random what you're actually able to get, and there's actually doubles in the deck as well. So you have little Kleiss. I think these are based off of German war commanders, which is even slightly more offensive. Support commander, you deploy the card. When you play it on a future turn, you see it's worth victory points as well. You may declare combat twice per turn, which you can usually only do once at the beginning of your tactics phase. You gain combat of X. X equals the number of tanks on your front line. So the support cards could be very, very powerful. And that's pretty much it. I could keep going on and show you more and more of the cards, but you get the general gist of it. It's Dominion-style deck building, but with an element of games like War Machine High Command, where you're deploying your troops in order to fight against cities and take those cards. Actually, it's more like the DC Comics deck building game in that sense, like you're fighting the supervillain stack. But in any event, but this came before all of that, I should point out. In any event, that is Barbarossa from Arclight and from Kamikaze Games. Let's get to my final thoughts.
So a couple things. First off, my final thoughts on this, at least in the first part, are going to sound very suspiciously similar to my final thoughts for Lap Dance. That's not by coincidence. I think that they both have controversial settings and themes, and so they're mirroring each other in a way, although in very different ways. So if it feels like I'm repeating myself, I apologize, but it's probably for a reason. The other thing is that one of my shticks on my channel is that I always wear these gaudy, kitschy shirts. I try to switch it up all the time and have different ones as much as I can. And I specifically want to wear my One Piece shirt for this because it's the most exaggeratedly anime shirt that I own. It's got these big gaudy pictures of the cast of the show. It looks terrible, but I like wearing it because I love One Piece. I love just showing it off. And I wanted to hammer home the fact that I am a huge anime fan, if you didn't know that already. It could be anime anything, whether it's just actual anime series, manga, which is closely related to anime, or anything that has an anime theme. I mean, Barbarossa is not an anime. It never was. But the style is anime. There are many shows that have some similar themes to Barbarossa. And, I could see it. And if you're an anime fan as well, you know what I'm talking about when I say that we're very forgiving of weirdness. We know all these different tropes that are in anime, and they're just like commonplace to us. But to someone that's outside of that bubble, they're very, very weird. Having said that, though, even for me, the theme of Barbarossa is just unnecessary and needlessly shocking. I wasn't necessarily offended by it, but then again, I'm not the target audience to get offended by it because I have no direct connection to World War II, nor did I have loved ones who were involved in World War II, and I don't have the correct ethnicity to have a history there to be rightfully offended by people making a game about cute, scantily clad anime girls who are in the German army wearing the Iron Cross fighting against Russia. And I know they go to great pains in the rulebook to say it's fictitious and alternate, and this is an alternate timeline and setting, and it's just for fun. And that might be the case, and it's at first, chuckle-worthy to see how exaggeratedly over the top that it is. I guess exaggeratedly is my word of the day, if it's even a word. But nevertheless, I couldn't help thinking all the time that, okay, this is worth a couple of chuckles, but it's so completely unnecessary to poke and prod people and to just stir up stuff for no particular reason. This could have been themed as anything. Keep the scantily clad girls, I guess, if you want, if you have to. I'm used to that by now. but put it in space. Make it just a generic war. Why does it have to be German officers, one of them named the Führer, wearing a Führer-type outfit, wearing the red armband with the Iron Cross instead of a swastika? Why do all these things have to be there? It's purely to shock people and to poke them and to prod them. It's just so unnecessary. I don't know why they felt the need to do that. I know you can come up with excuses. You can say, well, there's no swastikas there, so it's not that bad. And, the Japanese people are just kind of obsessed with old wars and military hardware. But there's not even any military hardware on the cards, really. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm not, super offended by the theme. But just like with Lap Dance, I totally get why people would be. And while I can make a case that Lap Dance was it was a cool idea to use that theme, even though it might offend some people because it was very interesting and it's a thing, it's commonplace in everyday life, whether it's good or bad for you. There was no reason for this to be themed like this. I don't care if it was 5 years ago or not, and I don't care if this was never intended to be released out of Japan or not. It is now. Kamikaze certainly could have released it with different artwork if they wanted to. Typically, I'm not for that. Maybe it would have been a good idea here. I don't know. There is a version of this game that does have historical artwork instead of cute, scantily clad anime girls. I don't know. It's just kind of silly, and this is one of those cases where I wish they would have just sidestepped the controversy if they could have. But let's talk about the game. Or actually, let's take a step back and talk about the components. There's no dividers in this box. I know it's not a huge deal, but every other game like Tanto Cuore that ArcLight released had dividers and that were brought over here by Japanime, like the kind of sister company to Kamikaze, that they had dividers. I don't know why this one doesn't. That's a bit of a weird thing, especially since there's so many individual decks of cards. But moving on to the gameplay. This is a game that kind of shows its age at this point. It's only 5 years old, and at the time it was probably quite revolutionary because it was definitely based on Dominion, which in that case, it was not trying to be that innovative, but having the different types of currency and deploying troops and fighting the decks must have seemed very new and fresh at the time. And there's definitely some really cool things going on here in the card interaction, how tactics points work, trying to work your way up to the better tank grade soldiers and infantry. The support deck, the strategy cards, there's so many different options. There's almost too many options out there for you to purchase from. And the idea of putting out your troops and then going to attack these different cities and working your way from fortified strategic positions and bunkers, all the way up to those cities is a very cool idea. But there's a couple of faults I have. First and foremost, I think that this concept of what's being done in the game has been done better in a couple of other deck building games since then, which is not really Barbarossa's fault. It's just a consequence of age. I think War Machine High Command handles the whole deployment and fighting over territory thing much better. And also the DC Comics deck building game, going after the supervillain cards just seems to work better and faster as an idea, rather than like the city stack in Barbarossa. That's immediately what it reminded me of. And that actually is the main problem I have with Barbarossa. That end game condition of having to go through the entire city stack takes so long. This game is way too long. Way, way, way too long, especially with the maximum player count, 4 or 5. Don't do it. This is much better with 2 or 3 players, and I would even recommend maybe taking some city cards out. Because the game can just drag on and have no excitement left whatsoever, especially since every game of it I played has seemed to just kind of balance out since everyone knew what they were doing. So one player would get a couple of cities, another player would get a couple of cities, to the point where it gets down to Moscow, and really it's whoever takes Moscow is going to win. So it's kind of anticlimactic anyways. You feel like, oh, why did we go through all those cities in the first place? The journey to get to that point, though, is interesting at times. I love some of the card combinations and how they interact with each other. There's certainly a ton of options for you to customize your own deck in any way that you see fit. It's just that the theme is tough to get through. Even though I do like the anime-style artwork, it's just a tough thing. I don't know why they had to go with this particular theme. And just the game is too long. And it just feels like it's showing its age compared to all the other deck builders that are out there. It's a decent game. I would even say it's a good game, but I don't know that I would grab it over so many other choices and options that I have. And you have to understand that when you're going to be playing with playing this game with certain people, they're going to be offended by the theme, and maybe they have every right to be. That is Barbarossa from ArcLight and Kamikaze Games.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com. Thanks for your support.